Your Holiness, we have, over the last 2 days, begun to survey this territory of craving, desire, and addiction. And we have covered both the basic neuroscientific research that gives us some clues about the brain mechanisms that are associated with wanting and liking. We have also considered some of the Buddhist psychology and how that relates to issues of craving and desire. And in the neuroscientific work that Ken presented, it was very basic research in the laboratory. And today, we're going to be extending that into the clinic with real people who suffer from addiction. And Your Holiness, today it's a personal thrill for me to introduce you to Nora Volkow. Nora is the first director of a national institute, one of the institutes at the National Institutes of Health that we've ever had here in Dharamsala. Nora is the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and in that role, she is a major scientific leader as well as a leader in the policy and treatment of individuals who suffer in this way. And she's probably the most influential person in the world in research and policy pertaining to addiction. And so, and she is a psychiatrist by training. I've known Nora for many years, and she is an old friend, and it's just a thrill that she accepted our invitation to participate, and I think in part because she has been inspired by some of your writings and teachings. And so with that, it's just a great honor to have Nora present this morning.
Welcome. Thank you.
So it's a privilege for me to be here, and I thank you for giving me this opportunity. And one of the things that I was hoping to gain a knowledge and insight is as we address the concept of addiction. To me, it epitomizes that state of the brain where the person has lost the ability to exert control over their desires and emotions. And the Buddhist tradition is basically exactly the opposite. So I think it would be extremely helpful for us to try to understand how can we help an individual that has lost that capacity regain it. I come from the medical tradition. And my experience has been as a physician and in dealing with patients, and I'm a psychiatrist, one of the very frustrating experiences was that people that were addicted to drugs were never treated. The addiction was ignored. And in the United States and in many places in Occident, addiction is treated as criminal behavior. And persons that are addicted to drugs are placed in jail. And the outcomes are actually very, very negative. So one of the passions on my life has been to try to understand what happens in the brain of people that are addicted so we can try to figure out ways to help them stop taking drugs. I've also been very committed towards making the healthcare system become responsible for the treatment of people that are addicted to drugs, such that they don't end up in prison, as opposed to being treated like we treat other diseases. It has been very difficult because addiction affects drugs, affects the function of the brain, and the brain expresses itself in behavior. So there is the preconception that you choose your behaviors and that every one of us has the same ability to choose and control. And with imaging, with brain imaging, we now are able to investigate specifically the different areas of the brain and try to determine, are there areas that are disrupted in people that are addicted. In my presentation, I'm going to be going over some of the main circuits or networks, as we call them now, that have been impaired by the repeated use of drugs. And that knowledge is valuable because it gives us goals that we can target towards remediating them. And that would be my conclusion at the end of the presentation. There have been several brain imaging technologies that have emerged over the past 20 years that have transformed our understanding of the human brain. You've been exposed extensively to MRI, and today my presentation is going to be about another one called positron emission tomography. Positron emission tomography is an imaging tool that allows us to look at chemistry and function. It's been used, for example, extensively to diagnose cancer, because in cancers, the cells change their biochemistry. And you can use chemical compounds that are labeled with a small concentration of radioactivity to actually locate those chemical changes where the tumor is occurring. It's used extensively to actually investigate how your heart is functioning. These particular images are generated with a radioactive glucose that has a half-life, very short half-life. And the technique is very sensitive, so you need to administer a tiny amount. This
Maybe you can say something about how glucose is a main nutrient of the brain and
And in this case, the images are with a radioactive glucose, small concentration, the heart. Our organs, our cells need sugar in order to produce the energy to function. The heart, its only function is contraction, contraction, contraction. This is the big muscle consuming a lot of glucose. This is an unfortunate patient that had a myocardial infarct. And you can use this technology to see the area of the muscle that is no longer functioning properly. Because, and you can see that because the cells are no longer taking the glucose because they are not contracting. And the surgeons can take these images and determine where their intervention is going to occur. We can use exactly the same technology, but image the brain, because the cells in the brain also require glucose in order to perform their functions. This is an image of the brain. It's an horizontal plane. It's like you cut it like this. This is anterior, this is posterior. And it is at this level on the top of your eyes. And this part here, the frontal cortex, is crucial for us to make analysis, decision, judgments, to be aware. That area, if you take, this is a normal person, the higher the colors, the higher the consumption of glucose. This is a person that is addicted to cocaine. And you can see that this whole area here, the orbital frontal cortex, has a very significant decrease in consumption of sugar because it's not active. And that in turn has given us the opportunity from the perspective of the healthcare system to say drug addiction fits the criteria of what we call a disease because we can identify that there is harm to the tissue. Just like you do with heart disease, there is harm to the muscle. Just like we do with drug addiction, there is harm to the area of the brain that allows us to exert judgment, decision, to control our desires. How does it happen? Why, of all of the chemical compounds that are in nature, there are just a very few of them that can produce addiction. And there's been an enormous amount of work done using experiments in animals that have shown that all of the drugs, whether it's cocaine, heroin, alcohol, all of them have a similar pharmacological effect, which is they increase dopamine, the chemical dopamine, in the nucleus accumbens. This nucleus accumbens is a main, what we call hub. In networks, there are centers that are very important on communication. The nucleus accumbens is the most important hub of the reward network. Reward is and yesterday we were discussing this, is a complex word that we have simplified as if there were one reward. It's evident that rewards are multiple. All of them require activation of the center. That does not make them the same. It just means that the coloring of a certain positive element to it, a certain positive experience, is associated with activation of the nucleus accumbens. But the activation by dopamine has a purpose. If I feel something positive, my brain automatically learns it and motivates my behavior towards performing that action that will increase the likelihood that I will have that same experience. And that's why nature, in its extraordinary wisdom,
Marel, tana Quran discussed the dopamine, yeah, Z level, tana nucleus accumbens the na level gala, and then the jeong over Chilia, the Tunya Cheche, the catching puts in, the Lala Revanashi, Lala that rewards Lala Revaset, the DJ and Dugala, and tea and tea to an Chawadal Jugan Dugala, and the Shugutina she got toy and go something, and go Revacher, Tanjit, the jeong over the.
And so dopamine has that when there is an experience that increases dopamine in the nucleus accumbens, it generates a memory that is going to drive you to want to repeat the behavior. The more intense that dopamine increase, the stronger the memory. And this has led many to recognize as drug addiction as a disease of memory, of learning. And yesterday when you were presenting on the experience of how the Buddha philosophy speaks of craving, there requires an experience. That experience requires to have, you spoke of sensual pleasure.
Yeah.
It's an experience that has to activate dopamine, and if it does, it will generate a memory that will elicit craving.
So the young but the temple in Yaje, and it did to a Guno Shuchirchi, and I got to take Shukun Juja and Combatayaj. You go Islam that so again Sebasete, because an ambition is Shemanashitarias.
Biologically, the function of the system is, among other things, to make us eat. And it's also, its function is when you, for the first time, you are in a place, you have no food, and you try a fruit. The fruit provides sugar, and the reward activates dopamine. You get conditioned. So the next day, when you are in the same environment and you see it, you desire it. And that is the way that biology has ensured that you will do and get that orange and eat it, ensuring your survival, because you need that for survival. That's how these whole systems evolve, and they are described in all of the mammals. They are described also in flies, in fish. It's a very, very primitive physiological system that has served nature very well. Drugs, for what we call randomness of chemistry, activate it. But it activates it in an artificial fashion, because it's not the experience of nature and you interacting with it that's activating that nucleus accumbens. It's a chemical substance that directly goes into the brain and by its molecular mechanisms stimulates this center. The chemistry alone, without the whole external experience. And it also, if you look at food, how much it increases dopamine. Drugs, this is amphetamine, are much more potent. That's one. This is very short-lasting. And experiences of that type that increase dopamine from nature, from food, from social interactions, are not so high, not so strong, and they are shorter-lasting. This is very strong and very long-lasting. This is not normal physiology, and is going to lead our tissues, our nerve cells, to try to adapt to it. And the brain is very good at adapting. So if in the past, so normally you require this amount of dopamine to stimulate you and to drive your behavior, you take something like cocaine and it's this gigantic, then the cells, in order to sustain the same level, bring everything down. So you were here and you would require this one. You take a drug, it goes up here. But then the system adapts and everything goes down. So that means that when you are not taking the drug, you do not have the drive. When you take a natural stimuli, you've lost the capacity of excitement by this adaptation. It's being brought down.
듬바다 저거죠. 다 텔은 느낌 중에 가진다. 니다 템비킹 제디 토적고자 앞에 쉬우지. 항상 좀 토부연되고 아니 레버코티 애답체제 아니 코마 마통베 랭가 마세베 마냥베랭가 아니 직 남에서 지단에 직 저다 도나다 근데 마용야지.
Now, this is another example of positron emission tomography on how we use it to measure in the human brain how drugs or other experiences increase dopamine in the nucleus accumbens. We use it in this case. In the other one, I show you an example of glucose, sugar. Here we use it with a compound. It's called raclopride. It's labeled with an isotope, a radioactive substance, 20 minutes half-life, very short half-life. And it binds to dopamine receptors. So dopamine is increased by drugs, and dopamine is a chemical, and cells in the brain communicate with each other through chemical signals, which we call neurotransmitters. But for so these cells wants to communicate to this one, releases dopamine. Dopamine is floating around, and but it wants to specifically activate certain cells or not. And the way that dopamine can do that is the cell that it has to stimulate has a receptor that can recognize it. So it's like a zip code that allows dopamine to go and signal. If you don't have that receptor, dopamine cannot interact. So these are the receptors. And with this substance, raclopride, we can label them. And you see them concentrated in red in the central parts of our brain, which is where the nucleus accumbens is located. We can image them with this radioactive, and you see the concentration. Then you can give a drug, and this is what we give here, a drug that we use in psychiatry to treat children with attention deficit disorder. This drug, methylphenidate, called Ritalin, I've been interested on it because it's very similar to cocaine. People don't like to know this, but it's very similar pharmacologically to cocaine. Psychiatrists don't want to know that. Its mechanism of action, identical to cocaine. Dopamine goes out when it's stimulated, it interacts with the receptors. This is terminated because they have these red proteins here that are transporters. They bring dopamine back into the cell. Dopamine goes up, it goes back in, out, in. Cocaine blocks it. This Ritalin methylphenidate blocks it. Then dopamine accumulates and it binds to the receptors and then signals reward. And that is what's believed to be why cocaine is so rewarding and so addictive. So if we've used the methylphenidate instead of cocaine, we block the transporter, dopamine accumulates, dopamine binds to these receptors so that when you give raclopride, these receptors are occupied and it cannot bind, and the binding goes down as a function of how much dopamine has been liberated. The more the dopamine, the more the receptors are occupied, and the less the raclopride can bind. And that's the way that we can actually, in the human being, measure changes in dopamine produced by a drug or by a natural stimuli on the basis of the decreases in raclopride binding. We can quantify these, and this is the quantification for different subjects. So this is an image, this is quantified. And at the same time that we're giving them methylphenidate, we're asking them, please describe how intense is the experience of reward that you're feeling with the drug. And what you find is the more the intense the experience, the greater the increases in dopamine. So in those individuals in whom dopamine is increased very much by the drug, there is a very intense experience of reward. Those that don't feel anything, that have no changes in dopamine. Indicating that in the human brain, these drugs, by increasing dopamine, are producing a subjective experience that individuals are describing as rewarding. But I want to note something that has always fascinated me. We're giving the same dose, and look at the variability. So each one of us as humans has a tremendous diversity on the way that we respond. And we know that from the environment, but also to a drug. And that, I think, is one of the starts when people ask me, well, why do some people become addicted and others do not? Not every brain responds to the drugs the same way. That's one of the first factors that's going to determine the differences in the approaches that people and vulnerability that people have to taking drugs and to becoming addicted. Because of this, and
야, 진짜게 한데 심주 제어왜 그게 드라그도 잘이야. 가서 우리 레스폰스랑 맨다면도 여기 야 시젤레베제 기타 야 지금 나다로 제주 참여관에 맨다 여기 진짜지 한테 제거를 말해.
So since there is this variability among individuals in their response to the dopamine, the kind of increase in their brain, as you pointed out, His Holiness is asking the question. So
But
given this, no,
some person more effective, some person less
effect.
So far the level.
So given this difference among individuals, has there been any research
in order
done?
to find the answer.
So
basic sort of structure, or the sort of
the chemical
or
compositions.
or the brain.
So has there been any research done on trying to figure out at the brain level why are these differences among individuals to responding? Is it because of the different chemistry in the brain, or is it different brain structures?
Absolutely, and that's one of the most interesting questions. Why? Why this one has this response here and this one this response
here?
here?
Why said the level mental you induzane said in new tender mental
So
So
in principle, one should be able to say that given the differences at the level of brain among individuals, that they will respond differently to the drugs.
One time, one scientist, at that time, at 6 billion human beings. So 6 billion human beings, because of the chromosome or this, some word you see, very subtle level, you see each one differences. So therefore, to 6 billion human beings, the perception of world also you see 6 billion
perceptions.
Yeah.
So that means, of course, roughly speaking, you see same brain, but very
Yes.
detailed, then differences.
Yeah.
So can you, so far, I mean, you mentioned that
So, given that there is this variation, so His Holiness's question is, what, that suggests that there is a difference at the level of the individual brain. So, what is that difference? I mean, have you been able to correlate
well, because the scientists already accepted there is differences.
now?
So, on that basis, now, because of that, because of
The differences.
No. Because of the particular case, that kind of brain, therefore, this sort of drug, less effect. Such case, because of that, the more effect.
Yes.
You can say that.
Yes, and that's exactly what I'm going to show in the next series of slides, because it is a very important question. That's the question that why we've been doing this research, trying to address it. And it was believed that people said, well, and in animals there is still a long belief on this, that individuals that are addicted to drugs have higher responses in dopamine and are more sensitive to the rewarding effects of drugs. And that was the belief in the psychiatry field, and it was what I believed. So I said, okay, let's test it, because that's why we do science. Let's see if the hypothesis was that people that were addicted to drugs, which is what psychiatrists believe, were addicted to them because in them the drug is more pleasurable, and therefore they seek it more. That's what I thought. I was totally wrong. And again, it's why one in science has to have the ability of changing one's conceptions, because otherwise nothing advances. This is the first study that we did. It did it many years ago in '97. Normal person, not addicted to drug, with intravenous methylphenidate, and you see that decreases. Cocaine abuser, no drug, we give them saline, a placebo. Cocaine abuser, intravenous methylphenidate. Visually, no difference. When you quantify control, cocaine abuser. So completely opposite to what we were predicting. Cocaine abusers, these were actually detoxified. They had been in the hospital for 3 weeks, have a very significant reduction in the increases in dopamine produced by the drug. Exactly opposite.
Can you say that again?
When we did this experiment,
Yes.
we expected that people that are addicted to drugs will have very large changes in dopamine. It was exactly the opposite. When we did it, cocaine abusers have very little responses, half that of controls, and they had been detoxified for 3 weeks. These were detoxified for 3 weeks. These were active. They were taking cocaine. We bring them to the clinic. We do the same study. This is a very recent, so this is better instrument. And it's all average. All of the subjects are average. Normal controls with methylphenidate, you see that decreases. Cocaine abusers, you don't see any differences. This is the active cocaine, this is the controls, and this is the active cocaine abusers. Dramatically reduced.
So in other words, the substance is not having the kind of effect one would expect.
Correct,
Yeah.
correct. And it is antithetical. Because,
why is love not correct?
So
Why?
why is that the case?
well, the case, when you give repeatedly these very potent drugs, it downregulates, the whole system downregulates. And that's why you have them hypofunctional. That's one of the hypotheses that's going on, that the system has reset itself.
되게 제든 줄이야 미규마에나 시부지기나
sensitive
sensitive but 디베다 sensitive 요에 마차제
Yeah, and what Rich is pointing me out is that this resetting is a consequence of repeated use of these very potent chemicals. The very negative aspect about it, we were speaking how much dopamine you need to stimulate, to excite you, to motivate your behavior. Natural rewards do this, drugs do that. So what happens when you are down like this? A natural reward cannot stimulate it. It won't be able to engage it. And so the person, an individual like this that is not even now able to respond to a very potent drug, cannot respond to a natural reward.
그렇죠.
그렇죠. 되게나 미규마 쪽에 니리니리 메시 나로리다 간다 자와 간다 차이네 수수 더베 슈고 도야다 군노케야다 저와테안들이야 도파민 그거레스 도파민이 되게 규메 내가블이야 야 파자 침부시다 매부 고고요 말레스 다든데 코켄다도 사인디가 디베 시우지 세토보게 기나샤자 아니베 더베 슈침부게 되고라 다 디기 아니 침부시부체도 레버콘데 어댑체제 the jelly and chow kumak tone, tonake, the benefit meets niri table at the dectone, to you insure tiritilia, tishun gets on a matter charge. Koshukunda church, and it chenda passion and zed to get to you, Mikumale, Shibuji, the shoot here, the Konzomate, Chigor stuck on the chick.
And this clinically makes it very hard because when you're trying to treat a person that's addicted to the drug, you need to engage them into everyday activities, into their life. But these stimuli are not activating them. And we haven't spoken about it. We were speaking about addiction yesterday, but there is rewards and natural rewards. There is a reward that is very, very universal in many instances, and that is money. And I put forward the concept that people can become addicted to money. We have not studied it. We don't like to speak about addiction to money, but it can produce very pathological behavior.
말에다 지단 미규마 망정을 가벼워 봐. 다 주제들이야 심슈 자원망 보지고 돈에 고주 심슈 게토야들이 연구매배 인사스. 다 우유고 돈에 심슈 대매로스 딱제 지고 그랬어. 그래서 미규마 망부정을 가벼워 봐.
And in the Occident, money in the United States is very rewarding. In the United States, money is very rewarding, and so we use it as experiments to activate the reward system of people in the United States. And cocaine abusers, the response to money is very attenuated in the reward centers. So they have an attenuation, food, sexual stimuli, money. All of that is attenuated. The system is not functioning properly. And that is the system that motivates behavior. So that is one of the hardest challenges in addressing the problem of drug addiction.
So, what about effects on the larger cognitive functions? Do they become duller?
Yes, and we'll get into that, absolutely. And I'll tell you why.
Then it gets very complicated, yeah.
Correct. It's not one system, it's not one network. It's multiple. When I was getting this data, my brain was hurting me because I couldn't understand it. And I couldn't understand it because we put forward the concept that you take drugs because they increase dopamine, and that is rewarding. But if they are not increasing dopamine, why are addicted people taking the drugs? It makes no sense, and my brain was very upset. It was like something is not clear-cut. And that's when I actually retraced my thinking to experiments done by a Russian physiologist, Pavlov, that showed with no technology, just cleverness, that when you take a neutral stimuli, a sound, and you repeatedly associate it with the meat, the dogs salivate when you expose the sound. Now, with imaging technologies and other types of technologies, we can do exactly the same experiments and look inside the brain and see what happens, why is it that's going on. And studies in rats, and this is one of the studies that have used what we call voltammetry, that allows to place an electrode inside the nucleus accumbens and measure dopamine, or microdialysis, have allowed researchers to look inside the brain and see what happens if they repeat Pavlov's experiment in the nucleus accumbens.
Yes, I mean, it's, how is that different from optogenetics?
Yeah.
Because you need to insert something.
The microdialysis and this data that I'm showing here, there are two techniques that are used to measure dopamine in animals in the nucleus accumbens. One of them is microdialysis. You put a probe directly inside the brain. It's invasive, so you have to open the skull, and then a very, very thin probe goes inside, and that allows you to extract fluid and quantify the concentration of dopamine. So when you give a drug, you can see that dopamine is going up. With voltammetry, it's more or less the similar process. You put in an electrode, but it actually is measuring changes in electrical signaling brought about by increases in dopamine. And so you can also quantify. Both of these techniques allows you to quantify the concentration of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens. And using these technologies, researchers have repeated Pavlov experiments with the food and the sound, and they've repeated them with the cocaine and the sound. And whether it's food or cocaine, the responses in the nucleus accumbens are the same. Drugs are literally hijacking the systems in the brain that evolved for us to seek food, ensure that we'll get them. And this is one of those experiments with cocaine, not with food. These are rats in green. They hear a tone, a sound, repeatedly for 2 weeks. They are brought into the laboratory. The purple rats, they are for 2 weeks exposed to the same sound, but every time they get the sound, they get cocaine. Then they are brought into the laboratory. This voltammetric probe is placed in their brains, and they are exposed to the sound, no cocaine. This is the animals, just the sound, never been exposed to association with the sound with cocaine. It's not salient, it's not rewarding, no change in dopamine. These animals had been repeatedly exposed when the sound was given, followed by cocaine. And then with the sound itself, dopamine goes up. There's no cocaine. Dopamine goes up.
Tantri kada ta toma tara di dajiche dadi
Dichu
shugulam ta terwa tadi shugule ani kuja experiment chebe ko ta yang ko tone dopamine chemical the in doba ke chemical cheba dia increase chetu
가서 drug 예를 들어.
na ta ta
견신.
ta dene ko di
맞다. 잠았다. drug 그게 가서 딱 냥 쇼스부터.
ngelan shosatla
And what is, this is incredibly important because the amount of dopamine, this rise, determines how much the animal is willing to work in order to get cocaine. So when the sound produces very strong signals, the animal will press the lever much more in order to get cocaine than when it actually is very little. This actually, what is happening is the sound has been learned in the brain that is going to predict the reward. And that when you're speaking about the Buddhist tradition of experience and then craving, what we were speaking about, that learning, this is exactly what gets transferred in the learning. The value gets assigned to the stimuli that predicts the reward. So you transfer the ability of the stimuli, call it the orange that I ate, or the drug that increases the dopamine, into the stimuli that just preceded it. Because it's the one that's telling me, it's the color orange that tells me, go for it. I need the dopamine to drive my behavior to get it. If I only get the dopamine when I eat it, and the dopamine drives my behavior, it's no longer useful. I already eaten it. Nature requires to generate a system that will motivate me to achieve the behavior. So it transfers that's why it's transferred the increases in dopamine that are motivating to the stimuli that precedes it in order to drive you. And that's why you do require the experience in order to learn it, so that stimuli that gets associated and you crave it.
그다음에 초와 주고 요랬어. 초와 되게 공부 차제. 공부도 주고를 제만이 되발람사 게토에 지운 거 요랬어. 초에 갱게 세버세데. 또다 되기도.
Yeah, no, and what Rich is explicitly saying is that the craving in these animals is the sound. The sound triggers the craving. And in addiction, what we deal with which very, very hard in patients, we treated them. The patient wants to stop taking the drug. We put them to a rehabilitation program. Then they go home, and they immediately relapse. And one of the problems that they do is that the moment that get in the environment where they've taken the drugs, those environmental acts like the sound. Rising dopamine, driving the behavior.
막 공부를 된사베나 다 타마냐다 텐세 수수 강보다 사자다 상하는 쪽 가와 있네. 고통과 점 그거나 레벨상 감사 세버게 돼.
And we see this here in this experiment.
저는 drug이 잠반염기요 말고.
So that means that the cocaine, the drug is not actually undermining the memory. The memory is there. So it's not really undoing the memory.
The cocaine generated the memory, but then...
잘 속미도 와.
So that means the mind is not dull, because there is quite a strong memory.
There's a very strong memory, extremely strong.
So memory is not damaged.
The memory is not damaged, it's strengthened.
memory 연속 그는 거래.
So where is that memory coming from?
From the experience.
말 레벨 세.
So what is the memory associated with in terms of brain chemistry?
Dopamine.
Dopamine.
Dopamine, when you get these very strong dopaminergic surges, when dopamine goes up very rapidly, you memorize. And it has to do with...
그 레벨에 시다고 저래요 말해.
So
That's why...
But there are kind of specific circuits associated with the memory, isn't there, in the brain?
Yeah, but
Yes.
this is why it's
So-
easier to remember stimuli that have emotional significance.
Let me go, and the circuits. I mean, memory. Two very important areas of memory: hippocampus.
Hippocampus.
Yesterday we were speaking about it. Hippocampus, we learn where things are located. We learn everyday events. Amygdala, we learn emotions. These two areas send projections, send contacts to the nucleus accumbens. And when you get exposed to these cues, these memories recognized both by the amygdala, both by the hippocampus, and through their projections, they stimulate the nucleus accumbens. And that is what's driving. And they also stimulate the dopamine cells directly. That drives the behavior.
So am I right in informing His Holiness that the memory discussion here is to a very specific, experience of the drug? We are not talking about memory in general. This kind of the clarity of the memory, the strength of the memory we are talking about here is the memory of that experience.
Correct. And that's why emotional memories are so powerful. They are very specific to the experience, but you learn them on one exposure, and they can modify your behavior for years. Positive or negative. So, now, in humans, with cocaine addicted people, again, these are cocaine abusers taking drugs. We bring that when you give them methylphenidate, no response, very little response. We bring them to the laboratory, 2 days, One day we show them videos of nature scenes, and another day we show them videos of people taking cocaine, which is they recognize as cues. It's a cue that tells them expect the drug, and we image them. This is the neutral video. This is the video of others when they are seeing others taking cocaine, and you can see the decrease because dopamine is going up just by observing others taking the drug. You can quantify changes in dopamine, changes in craving. In those people that are addicted, the larger the increases in dopamine produced by the cues, what we call the cues, the learn associations, the higher the changes in dopamine, the more intense the craving. Which is, and this is at one of the, I think, crucial disruptions in addiction. What you have is the reward system of the consumption itself, very attenuated. The expectation of the reward, sensitized, enhanced. So you expect much more, and that drives you. And then you take the drug. But it's that drives that is disruptive, that is driving the behavior of the person that's addicted. That very strong memory. Now you asked me the question, what about cognition? What happens in the brain of a person that's addicted to drugs? Are there those processes disrupted? Dopamine regulates, modulates reward and motivation, but it also regulates our frontal cortex. All of the processes of the frontal cortex, very large area of our brain, is modulated by dopamine. And if you damage dopamine, then you cannot think clearly. And there are diseases where there is schizophrenia, for example, is a disease where there is dysfunction of dopamine, and the whole frontal cortex gets harmed by it. In drug addiction, researchers had not paid attention to the frontal cortex because it's thought of thinking, not emotions, which are limbic. And yet, if you're taking a drug and you are producing these very large changes in dopamine, it's going to go through all of your brain, not just the limbic brain. So are there adaptations also in the frontal cortex? And that's what we've been investigating. Are there adaptations in the frontal cortex when people take drugs, just like we've seen in the limbic brain? And the way that we look at it with this positron emission tomography is we test them twice. One of them is we measure the number of dopamine receptors, dopamine D2 receptors, and at the same time, we measure brain glucose metabolism. So we do 2 scans, one with a ligand that can allow us measure how many receptors, dopamine receptors. Ligand is a compound that you use in order as a marker. It's a marker that you use with positron emission tomography.
It's also kind of something that has a very short life, yeah?
Very short life, 20 minutes. So this is 20-minute half-life. And then we measure how much glucose, how much sugar the brain is consuming. And then we determine if there are changes. First of all, we ask...
Right in thinking that the more receptors there are, there's going to be greater intake of dopamine. Is that the idea?
The greater the number of receptors, the more potent the response.
Okay.
And we wanted to know if there are changes in receptors with addiction, which we didn't know at that time. Is that in turn associated with changes in brain function? That's why we are using the 2 markers.
남주에 제하다 당신 제 차실 더 내고 도면도 따위나 따다는 고수 케미컬 대제 디 차시 그 레벨 더 글루코스 그 돈에 자원 망아지기도 자원 용아지기도 따제 또 지고 그래서
So we've been studying multiple type of addictions: cocaine, methamphetamine, alcohol, heroin. These are images of controls on dopamine receptors, and these are images of people addicted to these drugs, dopamine receptors. And you can see that the receptors, we're giving no drug, just resting. You can see that the receptor levels, the concentration of receptors is actually significantly decreased across all of these addictions of dopamine D2 receptors. And I'm explicitly stating D2 receptors, because I'll come back to it. There are 5 different types of dopamine receptors. And D2 receptors are one of the most important receptors signaling dopaminergic mechanisms. Whether you study patients, this is what you see here is the measure of dopamine receptors as a function of age. And I'm plotting it like that because whether you are a normal control in pink or a cocaine abuser in green, as you grow older, the levels of dopamine D2 receptors in our brain, the levels of dopamine D1 receptors in our brain too, go down. That's a normal process of aging. You can see it here. These are individuals in the hospital. These are a different group that is studied in an outpatient clinic outside the hospital, not taking cocaine either, but they were cocaine abusers. You can see that as a whole, cocaine abusers have lower levels of these dopamine D2 receptors than controls, which is this particular finding replicated many, many times. These are humans. They've replicated in animals that have been exposed to drugs. Dopamine D2 receptors go down with exposure to drugs. But what intrigues me, and again, is one of the things in my brain that didn't let me go, variability. We're bringing back again the concept of variability. And this is biology, which is not that addiction is as a group, they are lower. But look at this addicted person that looks like normal, or look at this normal person that looks like an addict. There is overlap. They are statistically significantly different, but there are some overlap. And this is an important question because when you have, and this is biology, diversity by excellence. If there is that diversity, first, how do you interpret data like this? Low D2 receptors clearly seems to be involved in addiction. But it's not, if you have low levels of dopamine D2 receptors.
So explain the difference between the two graphs, the one on the top and one on the bottom.
Replication studies. This was the first study we did.
The manganal, you have to get the outpatient chair, the jangu de Zesanya, Mabu de Zemasanya. That the Morancas was good to the chicken managing mid Suzutamida, Yovinzans, Benadan de Ordinaria Mabu, Chick the Zemasanya and take a T2 receptor, than the Zesanya and Gumshow and Shinchik. To us. That the current that can chick, Konyunga chick boogie, that you can chant Sangi members didn't. So by was this. So it's your point that given that we see these low D2 receptors even among non-addicts, this particular person. So that means the low D2 receptors is not a sufficient condition to explain.
Not a sufficient
condition, yeah.
It increases, it makes you more vulnerable, but it's not sufficient. And if I, as a physician, what I'd love to have is a medication that increases receptors. Because if my hypothesis that these low levels of receptors is making them vulnerable to take drugs, if I had such a medication, I could prove that it is causally linked to vulnerability. But I don't have that medication.
다디르샤도 뭐랑 처바 제베나 미규마 겐곰 마슈니 콘돌레 D2 receptor nyunga yunye yobe inzas ta morang choba de rangshing ton D2 receptor nyunga yunye di ene zenge boten le ngom shwa ya go nyanga che yo rochi tus is that the meng ton jodob che ta na me yo mares the D2 receptor mar tang be na kuzu de ngom ma shwa ya tabje me ro sta dan choba rares.
And Rich is pointing out very well, not just a medication, an intervention. Can we do an intervention that increases the levels of dopamine D2 receptors? And we can go back to what type of behavioral intervention perhaps could work. So, in animals, we can test it because we can do gene therapy in animals. So we've done 3 separate experiments. The results are the same. What we do is we make animals addicted to alcohol or cocaine. This is alcohol data. We do gene therapy by putting the gene that encodes for the D2 receptor inside the virus. We put the gene.
Explain what you mean by gene therapy.
Yeah, no, the notion of gene therapy, of course, has been around for many years. The challenge is how do you deliver the gene to the area that you want? And the idea is by bringing the gene inside the area, a gene that you want the protein to be expressed. I want D2 receptors to go up. So if I put the gene that is basically encoding for the D2 receptor and I can deliver it to the nucleus accumbens, can I increase the levels of dopamine D2 receptors there? And then I can, if then, what happens to drug taking? Can I change it? So that's what we did here. The strategy that you use to deliver a gene is a virus. Viruses have evolved to link to cells and to inject genes. That's exactly what a virus does. So we use them experimentally to inject the gene into the nucleus accumbens. Dopamine receptors go up. It's very short-lasting because these go up very rapidly. This is 4 days after we inject them. But at day 10, they are no longer there. It's very, very short-lasting, a few days. We inject them at day 20, and they go up again. And when we ask the question, what happened to, this case, alcohol drinking? This is 0. Change in alcohol drinking, it dramatically decreases. When we have high receptors, D2 receptors, alcohol drinking goes down. The D2 receptors go back to baseline. Alcohol drinking goes back to baseline. We inject again, D2 receptors go up, alcohol drinking goes down dramatically. So increasing one...
The D2 receptor, the D2 receptor, the mikuma ngengo masho ni nalo le to mabu de tanga mabu yutu kala ta thiri di ngengo sho ya le rangshing ge chane ba ja che me ro samdang gorwa nyaga che ta de chota che le ya ta de zili ya gene therapy che nucleus implant engam se de lebe nalo tan dopamine ke sa jorwa di nalo le ya ne D2 dopamine 2 receptor dopamine 2 juya ke je de lu sha benas 루제 교르부 대금도 코 대베른가 나 아니 창통해야 돼 용루도스 다코 네버 총총총도 이걸 창통해야 돼 말이지 다시 한번 주 쇼골이 안 겨도 고 루샤도 이걸 야 총통 창통해 용루지 다코 네버 마냠도 이걸 야 창통해야 돼 말이지 고 제어해 보지 도스.
So what we now know is that D2 receptors, low levels, makes you vulnerable to taking drugs. If you increase it, it protects you. And yesterday, Ken mentioned there are 5 receptors, the ones that are most significant in modulating behavior of reward are D2 and D1, and they are like the yin and the yang. D1 stimulation enhances rewarding effects of drugs. D2 stimulation decreases them. So if you harm D1 receptors, if you decrease or inhibit their function, D1, you decrease rewarding effects of drugs. But if you decrease the function of D2, you enhance them. So what you are seeing in cocaine addiction is a decrease in function of the D2 receptors, which normally protects you, making you more vulnerable for the compulsive consumption of drugs or other behaviors. This is the D1, D2 yin-yang opposing one another is not just for drugs. It's a mechanism that evolved to modulate, to create a balance between reward systems. It's the same thing with movement, motor behaviors. D1 promotes motion, D2 attenuates some of the signals.
The D1 the D2 님 상계단이 나시 제제 D1 숙침부여나 야 맹검 쇼야게 네버체체 D2 그 D 숙제여나 맹검 마쇼야게 그니 버를 때요. 니가 도면 더 되어 있더니 이래서.
Now, the issue in biology is this is one protein, and the brain is incredibly complex. So how is it doing it? Why is it? How can a low level of dopamine D2 receptors here, how can it change our behavior so dramatically? And that's why we were looking at brain glucose metabolism, to be able to ask the question, when there is a decrease in these D2 receptors, what areas of the brain get affected? And that's why we were doing both receptors here in multiple types of addiction, cocaine, methamphetamine, alcohol. At the same time, brain glucose metabolism. So these are two planes, brain glucose metabolism and in a control, brain glucose metabolism in a cocaine abuser. And that was the first slide that's showing decreases in orbital frontal cortex, this part of the brain. And also, orbital frontal cortex is called because on top of our orbits, the eyes. And the anterior cingulate gyrus, which is also an area here that goes from here to here, and the anterior part of the brain. And what we found is that the lower the levels of receptors, the lower the metabolism in these two areas of the brain, orbital frontal cortex and cingulate gyrus. And this is whether you are a cocaine abuser, the lower the receptors, the lower the metabolism in these areas. In methamphetamine abuser, the lower the receptors, the lower the metabolism. Alcoholics, the lower the receptors, the lower their metabolism. And this comes to the question exactly about what are the cognitive consequences? What are the cognitive consequences of not having your orbital frontal cortex, your anterior cingulate gyrus, and other parts of the prefrontal cortex? And they are multiple, and they are not straightforward and simple. In the case of the cingulate gyrus is an area of the brain that allows you to detect discordances. So you make an analysis and you see something that does not fit what you expected. So you are predicting something and it does not make sense. Like when I got the data that people taking drugs, addicted people, where dopamine was not going up, that did not make sense in my brain. That was the cingulate gyrus must have got activated. So it allows you to see a dissonance.
The level chashet and a single jar the Nyambayana, Nangay Lamsan Tomotoyak.
And it is certain, of course,
So
extraordinary.
in other words, you're saying that the ability to see inconsistencies get taken out.
Or an error. Or an error.
And you know to show but Nangay over to get the Lamsan Tomotoyak.
So
난게 철학시하는 말도 난게 참고도 배도 남주전에 가고 있다.
So of course we're talking about inconsistency at the kind of a conventional everyday level, because we could be all upholding in inconsistent positions at a very subtle level.
Correct. And you may not want to accept it, and your brain may ignore it. But you don't. But if your brain is truthful, it will not ignore it, and it will detect, and the single gyros will send a signal.
근데 진짜 레벨 차시 되게 레가 들어서 그 나네 메트보다 드리도 걸 메트보다 먼저 제투해지.
So that the single gyros does that. The orbital frontal cortex does also something that is extremely fascinating, and that is this area assigns value to stimuli. So water is very valuable when I'm thirsty. If I drink 2 liters of it, no longer value to my brain. And that changes my attention. The orbital frontal cortex, I'm very thirsty. It drives my attention as this is very salient, sends a signal to the dopamine system, nucleus accumbens, motivates my behavior to drink it. I'm already full. I've drank 2 glasses of water. I have it there. My orbital frontal cortex says, don't pay attention to it, pay attention to the slides. And I shift my attention here, and this is no longer valuable to me. So the value is changed by the context, and the context changes my behavior. If I damage the orbital frontal cortex, and we can do this in animals, and patients can have a tumor or the trauma into this area of the brain, so we now know what happens when you damage it. You have an animal, and the animal, this is orange juice, the animal is pressing a lever to get the orange juice, presses the lever, gets the orange juice. Researcher says, let's remove the orange juice. The animal presses the lever 2 or 3 times, sees no reward, stops, no reward. The lever is no longer rewarded. Damage orbital frontal cortex. The animal gets the orange juice, learns normally. You remove it, the animal presses the lever and presses the lever and presses the lever and presses the lever and doesn't stop. It has lost the ability to change its behavior when that is no longer rewarding.
아주 이단 원부 시에 줘다 단 저 시다 봐. 그렇죠. 다 원시 배신 배배전에 이루 장장가는 또 삼든전 다지 제 요걸 관조도.
라레.
안데 대진 되는 민도 원시 돈은 저 되고 봐.
라레.
자. 다나 그러면 미티우스로 제제 유는 붙이기다도 가서래. 고물을 잡지. 성도 장장 같은 요도 되잖아요. 안데 제디 요 가서 냥금 쇼트 마셔를 켜가도.
So His Holiness is saying,
yes.
So all of this data is really kind of drawn from kind of sensory modalities. You're seeing something, experiencing it, reaching out for it. So imagine, say, yesterday.
So that on that level is common, animals and human beings. Now mental level, we are much more sort of sophisticated than animal. So the drugs have the illusion.
So on the
dopamine.
So if we were to imagine kind of the motivation and all of this at the level of mental experience alone, not in relation to particular stimuli, which is primarily sensory experience. So then in that case, between the addict and the non-addict, can you see a similar differences in the dopamine receptor decrease and all of this?
Yes, definitively. And what happens is that in terms of how we process very complex information or what drives our lives, there are 2 components. One of them is, of course, internal, and what your decisions and your lifestyles are that guides our behavior. But there's always the exposure to environments that can make us do things that have a surprise and that drive our behavior. So it's that interaction, dynamic interaction between inner and outer. A person that's addicted, that has this type of damage, becomes rigid and inflexible.
그런 직ran 지간 대대로 도자로.
There is a psychiatric disease that shares in common with addiction. It's not the same disease, but they share in common damage to these areas of the brain. And that disease is obsessive compulsive disorder. And patients with obsessive compulsive disorder will wash and wash and wash and wash their hands. They know they are clean. They cannot stop it. They've lost the capacity to change their behavior when they actually have achieved the goal. It becomes repetitive, where it's all automatic behavior. And it's very similar. I've been told I ask the question to my patients, why are you taking the drug? And you get different types of answers. But one that emerges frequently, they'll look at me and they say, I don't know. That drug is not even rewarding. It's not pleasurable. I just cannot stop it. I just cannot stop it. And that is conceptually very difficult because we all have control. We all can stop. So to be in a state where you've lost that ability, where you literally have become a slave of an automatic process. And yesterday there was in the discussions of when we were saying, can you inhibit the craving? You can prepare yourself if you know it's going to happen, but it's like touching a hot thing and you immediately react. Because it does not get to the cortex. It's an automatic response that then, with the damage of these areas of the brain, results in a perseverative behavior.
Just going back to your point, Your Holiness, with obsessive compulsive disorder of the sort that Nora was talking about, it's not just repetitive behavior, it's also repetitive thoughts. It's repetitive in mental activity as well as in behavior. So it affects both in a similar way.
And at the beginning you were asking me...
So he's also saying that even in the thought processes, we need to make a distinction between many of the thought processes that recall a sensory experience. The memory is thought, but it is pertaining to a sensory experience that the person had. But they could also be purely mental level memories as well.
Correct, totally. And I think in the discussion is, could you generate an obsessive compulsive state like this vis-a-vis thinking process, where you cannot stop thinking about something and that in itself becomes the pathology.
Compulsion. So his Holiness is saying that, in a sense, meditation is also aimed at cultivating a particular habit. And then the Tibetan word for meditation. So the Tibetan word for meditation is. So the Tibetan word for meditation has the connotation of cultivating familiarity. So the idea is you cultivate a particular way of being or thinking, and it becomes part of your habit, and ultimately it culminates in a form where you don't even have to make a conscious effort to evoke it. It becomes spontaneous.
But it doesn't hijack you in the same way.
로게
랑라
남주
참.
랑라에 말아서
여머리.
좀 연금 쇼니들 랑라.
제대로 왔어요.
So the difference is, yes, of course, you never lose that agency, you never lose the self-control.
Correct. That's, I mean, I would say it is in a way the opposite, right? Because it's something that you are using as opposed to it taking you over.
Taking you over. This
But the-
kind of 지단 공부 임바 단다질이야. 다는 공부 돈은 공부 차버디.
그 다르다, 그럼.
도저래셔서 그래서 공부 전에
저것도 랑안 배웠어.
어디 랑안 배웠어.
제대로.
나는 공부 전에 공부 차버디 체도니 로장제.
다들 뒤에와 치토되게. 일류 때문에 배로 차잖아. 지 갖다 전다직 삼다네. 뒤그집 마이를 세워 탈라. 원부시베 때문에 지 사차 전도들이 묻는 제대야지. 다 뒤에 거르고도 그게 거르고 전부 또 열었다.
라렐.
좋아. 더 차고다.
라렐.
아니 두번도 지 싸워다. 지도 돌이야. 원부시베 자치고로.
라렐.
이내 그 일루디 남주한 삼단데 되게 땅도 제도 그거다 지냐네. 냠샤 그거 냠네. 제도 그거 냠네. 지 그냥 개와시도 가.
라렐.
뒤한테 레벨 시제 도그래.
So in the Buddhist or in the kind of classical Indian psychology, there is this understanding that when you come out of a formal sitting and meditation where you are in a kind of an equipoise state of mind and you engage with the world, you can do so while at the mental level you are still, keeping awareness of what you were thinking, what you were meditating upon, and at the same time fully function in the everyday world of eating, walking, and so in some sense there is a kind of activity taking place both at the mental level as well as the sensory level. So from the kind of neuroscience point of view, how would that
다 레벨 개발을 거이나.
how would that express itself at the level of brain?
And again, this is we're just starting.
그런 거는 이제 곰 추억이게 시작 말다. 그러나 양행이 쌤 동대비지. 양행이 그 지르고 마이어랑 안에 그생도 제대로.
So in fact, we can ignore the set aside the kind of the meditative experience, but even someone who is in a kind of a deep state of grief,
그냥 가시고 싶지.
or intense joy, while that kind of tone of that experience lasts, you can still function by eating and walking around and so on.
Yeah, they are not exclusive. The brain, we have the capacity to experience a level of emotional consciousness and a level of cognitive consciousness and an experiential one. And it's the richness and the integration of all of those experiences that is optimal. In addiction, you basically have destroyed that integration at the expense of a very strong memory that drives the expectation of a reward and that's taken over the behaviors. So if you lost that capacity, and that capacity to actually integrate these levels of consciousness varies a lot from person to person. So we're, again, speaking of a continuum where addiction is at the extreme and where the capacity through meditation to be able to experience fully all of these levels is at the other extreme. And us more, I don't know where I am. When I'm sleep deprived, I'm probably more to the right. When you're very tired, you have that gets impaired. So we all have a certain fluctuation. We're all not always optimal.
지난 몇 주만 전에 간다 지 와시에다 이로 니가기 노냠보 용대 애들이야 다 채트면 그랬어. 로장 마장 돈. 다 곰게 돈 로장님 좀 배제 채토. 샤 아니 그냥 곰쇼니 되게 되네. 탈을 놓지다 고주 지그란 지 맞잖아. 다 그때 제대
지선 레벨 간에 심주체니 따디한다 이루 장장 더 공연 시험을 내가 지금 윈도우스 당시 루지도 그 뒤에 요소지나 따디한테 즉 가서 올게 즉 다스게 가서 오래 따로 맨다 통토야 연하면
So His Holiness is actually raising a more fundamental question, which is that
이만 무슨 그렇죠. 똑보다 도움이 계셔야 되는 게
So in the classical Indian psychology, quite a clear distinction is drawn between experiences that are occurring through the sensory modalities, the sensory experiences and perceptions and so on the one hand, and mental level experience, which includes thoughts, dreams, memory, and so on. And they are seen as actually two kind of, in some sense, categorically distinct mental processes. So the question is, this is a question that came up in the past as well. Are there possibilities from the current
Or so far,
level
any
of
sort of
neuroscience
today found some sort of sign on the brain level.
distinguish between the two?
Yes. And yesterday was mentioned, there is a network that is called the default mode network that allows you to have internal awareness. And the default mode network gets inhibited when you are focusing your attention to an outward task. And at the same time, these two are shifting back and forth, because if you only stay outward, you cannot go inside yourself and try to extract information. So the ability to shift back promptly in a seamless experience is optimal for integrating sensory experience and internal consciousness. If, however, you cannot shift and you are only driven by the internal, you lose the external output. So that ability of going back and forth in a way that is, again, seamless is what generates the optimal experience. So that default mode network, for example, has been implicated in diseases like addiction. In addiction, you are driven by the default mode network that makes you aware of your craving for the drug. In chronic pain, the default mode networks drives you to the perception of pain. In depression, suffering. So the default mode network gets engaged, hyper-engaged.
가서
다단한데 이것도 근데 몰라서나 default mode network 세조레스 레베ክ 랑랑신 내급 서치 다데 이로 돈은 영어만 붙이 코던데 버체 되는 미규마조
이로 가서.
이로 나 답변하지 나한테 셈데 다 양에 단데 중벽갈 그래서 다디 미규마조이나 the default mode network 다 아니 로치로 파초연이부터 송제가 돈은 도제 아니 왕식 유통한테 템베서 도야다 간단 예시 장도에 되게 좀 연구요레스 다든다 연금 쇼년 디디 아니 치료의 유리야 주제되는 때문에 수수 영장장이야 이 무엇이 되는 템버상만 네가 봉제 아니 치료 유다 유를 주게 돼 제도고요 말했어.
So
I think it's a bit more
얘는 콤바이 보통 말아.
나름
치료 일전에 마신도 콤바이 보통 말아.
the combat real. So for example, like in the case of an addict, if they are not able to kind of relate to the outside world, but get stuck in the default mode network, then what about by the fact that they are walking, or do they is it understood in terms of an automatic?
You can engage on walking. The default mode network is making them hyper-aware that they are craving the drug. It's a strong memory. But the motors, they can engage in motor systems. It's an automatic behavior.
So one way to think about the walking is that when they're walking, they're likely still thinking about seeking their drug.
That's right.
Yeah.
루시기 자와드시기 있죠.
자기 지금
그 일루디 안도 동행이면 너가 내가 갈때
다르죠.
And they can, when a person is addicted to drugs, they can engage in very complex behaviors to ensure that they can get the drug.
그래서 그 치료에다 되어요. 가서 또 니다도 세가 도.
세상에 안 되셔. 또 됐다. 다 레벨 가네. 다 레바 디가한테 그 이류 그 동네 시대부터 소리한테 디가는 연구하랬어. 답게 지금 루시다 지금 그게 자차디디 레벨 때 되는 연구하랬어. 디셔 소통하랬어.
So his holiness question is the following. For example, if someone is in grief, the grief is a mental experience, and such a person may still be walking around and doing things
or listening music.
So there is a sensory modality still active. So can neuroscientists kind of look at the brain and say, okay, so the grief component, which is the mental part, is in this area, and the sensory experiences that are occurring, like hearing music or walking and feeling the tactile sensations, this is being, this is this part of the brain that does it.
Yes, absolutely.
While is a person listening music.
Yes.
Meantime, the mentally the grief higher level,
Quite high level,
or
intense.
Comparatively less.
I mean,
so can see on brain.
Yeah, I think you can show that there are the intrusions of the grief that are superimposed upon listening to the music or walking or whatever other kind of behavior there is. And there is a graded intensity of the superimposition of the emotion, in this case grief, that may be occurring on top of whatever the dominant behavior might be, whether it's listening to music or walking.
The grief 양해롭지는 그 총용체인자 그 용조계에서 레벨 차실 때 되고라 다 왕식 저간다 자변에 간제변에 콜바 캬베 소리지 그거가 까베 소리지 되게 돈에 띄운 거요 그래서
다만 진리가는 냠용한테 답게 냠용 소리 뮤직 프로젝트 다시 테스트 다시 수스데 레벨다 파티 숙스테 다 레벨 파르고 어떻게 되지는 딱고 안데 수수 까면 그 삼류비는 양행 흘러죽지 체슈간 되셨어. 다 까면디고리 또 총신샷으니 레벨 짱짱 때니 그게 영원히 그래.
So if that is the case, is it possible, for example, in a lab, you have someone, in intense grief, lying in the, whatever it is, MRI or whatever it is, and then you have, or someone in an intense joy.
Always the negative side. I don't like that.
So, and then you have a monitor where you can see the brain images coming through, and by simply looking at the brain images, can you infer that at that moment the person has this intense experience of grief, and at that point there's a less, intense experience of grief or joy or whatever it is?
Well, we can both answer that, but with regard to grief, there have been studies that have been done.
Like me too, you see the while you meditate. But that younger.
Yeah.
세상에다
Yeah, so what Matthew is referring to is when he is in the scanner, if he's generating compassion at different strengths, you can tell by looking at the brain images the extent to which he is generating the compassion. In the case of someone who's grieving, in a depressed individual, the extent to which the default mode that Nora was referring to is intruding into other activity, that is a sign that there is increased, typically it's rumination, and it's often very self-focused rumination that is occurring. And the greater the intrusion of the default mode into external activity, the greater the amount of rumination.
간다직 양해 제배나 양해의 망부지 릭디 수수 간다직 랑진선의 대외 부장으로 자기어렸어. 양해 되기 수수랑기 때도다 대외자 대기엔 그 ruminations 랍디고라 남 레도 망부지 남도 자기어 빈디고라 디기 남규디 레베톤에 저바 제두고 어렸을 때 그 캡치 좀 가도 요마야 된 주존에
다음에 아들이 미디어 그다도 가서 레벨이 그 바로 바티브도 때 바르게 바르다 그 레벨도 십주체 때도 그 미투 안데 인지 민은 짜도 되네 가서 왔다 뒤윤직선도 그냥 까만직선이야 니좀 그 짜도 돼 되네 로 땅용 때야 시당식결 주 다지 그 레벨 난 디시도 그래 다한테 시다기 변내 그러죠 안데 인지 변내 그러죠 시도 그래
So the next question is, imagine Matthew in the scanner, and you have images being fed live.
we usually call guinea pigs 그래
Yeah, Solons was saying that he usually refers to Matthew as a guinea pig.
human이다 human guinea pig
So,
빅슈
yeah,
guinea
a
pig
monk guinea pig. So imagine there's the kind of the images being fed through in real time, and now Matthew is doing, say, for example, in intense compassion meditation. He's generating compassion, and then goes back to a kind of a more neutral state, and then he deliberately generates kind of an anger. And now the experimenter or researcher, without knowing this, simply looking at the images, the monitor, can you say now Matthew is in compassion and now he has generated anger?
so within 5 minutes watch
Yeah.
the person using different sort of experiences
Experience.
I mean, this is a big challenge for neuroscience today, and what you're referring to, Your Holiness, has been referred to in the scientific community as the problem of reverse inference. Can we use just information about the brain to make inference about the internal experience of a human being? And I think that you will find neuroscientists vary in their level of confidence. There are certain kinds of experiences where I think most neuroscientists would say we can do that quite well now, using information about the brain to make an inference about experience. So, for example, with visual experiences, I think that in the area of pain, there's a major paper which has just been published in the New England Journal of Medicine showing that you can use the signature from the MRI extraordinarily accurately to know the intensity of pain that a person is experiencing. So you can use...
His own things. That's a sort of a tactile, physical sensation. So
We need to start somewhere.
the coach 사진은 쪽으로 와서, the coach 당보도 사진은 쪽으로 와서, 다고 락산에서. But you do need to start from somewhere. But you do need to start from somewhere that has some resemblance to what you want to study later on. Because we are talking about mental level experience. And if we get stuck on the sensory experience like physical pain, there seems to be a disconnect.
Although pain does have an important mental component, which is the
In the debating tradition, when answers like that, questions like that, answers like that are given, we say there is no entailment here. No entailment. It's not necessary. Yeah.
I know when someone is craving by looking at their brain.
yes.
Craving, you can pick it up. And so craving, but it's and that's between a sensation and physical experience. Craving, you can see the signature.
Yes.
And you asked me at the
So a lot of these has very strong physical component, though, this craving that you're talking about.
Yes.
yeah.
For the substance.
And you asked me at the beginning why the variability, and one of the factors that contributes to variability is genetics. Each one of us is born with genes that are going to influence how our brain gets organized. And in addiction, there is a very strong genetic component. And it's estimated that at least half of the variance on vulnerability for addiction is genetic. What we don't completely understand is how that gene transforms into that vulnerability. We also know that environment is very important, and particularly development. And particularly important in development is as exposure to stressors during childhood. And exposure to stressors, for example, the, physical abuse or neglect of a child with no physical contact is in animal, when they do something similar in animals, decreases D2 receptors in striatum. So stress decreases D2 receptor, making you more vulnerable to these compulsive behaviors. Genes also make you more vulnerable. And this is a study that we did on individuals who were not alcoholics, but who came from a family history of alcoholism. Their father was an alcoholic. They had another first-degree relative that was an alcoholic. And we wanted to know if one of the inherited factors was low levels of dopamine D2 receptors. And if that was the case, whether they would also have abnormal function on the frontal cortex. And what we found was a big surprise. I mean, it was our theory that you inherited low levels of dopamine D2 receptor was incorrect. When we took these individuals, family history, high risk, heritability, but they were not alcoholics. Their levels of dopamine D2 receptors were actually higher than those of normal people that had no family history. And those high levels, in turn, were associated with normal activity in the whole prefrontal cortex. So we interpreted this to indicate that the reason why these individuals with genetic vulnerability, genes that we don't know what they are not alcoholics, is they've been able to compensate. They are compensating by increasing receptors that allows them to have optimal function on the prefrontal cortex. And that, in turn, protects them. If they were to drink alcohol, receptors would go down, and this would unbalance. So what's the use of this knowledge as it relates specifically to drug addiction? And this is a very simplified diagram that clearly identifies what you already mentioned, that addiction is not just the pathology of decreased sensitivity of the reward motivation system, enhanced sensitivity of the learned memory, very strong memory, but also disruption of cognitive operations. In our everyday life, each one of us is exposed to situations where we enter in conflict. I like something, I want to do it, but my consciousness says, no, it's not a good idea. And to the extent that we negotiate within ourselves, we finally do the right thing. But we all get what we call temptations. So in temptations, we have to make a decision of, do we allow ourselves to go or not? In general, I like to say that my frontal cortex enables me most of the time to resist temptation. And it is, as I can make a diagram, this is my prefrontal cortex in blue. This is the drive motivation that I have to do something in green. This is the saliency value, how valuable it is for me in red. This is the memory. I find a stimuli that I like chocolates, I confess, so it's a chocolate here. I am salivating, my memory is expecting that this is pleasurable, it is important, I get excited, and then my prefrontal cortex says, do not eat it because you shouldn't eat it. I don't know why, but it says, Nora, don't eat it. And my prefrontal cortex, which can be very draconian, says to the motivation, actually inhibits it. And I stop. I don't eat it. the prefrontal cortex inhibits the whole drive.
And this is the very system that allows the child to resist eating the marshmallow right away and to be able to wait.
Yes. And I told Richie that if he had put those marshmallows, I would have failed. I would have eaten them immediately. You didn't put me on the marshmallow, you know. So this is a normal person. So it's a landscape of circuits that allows you to optimally function and make the right decision. In a person that's addicted, you have a very different landscape. Prefrontal cortex is diminished in its influence. It's hypoactive. Memory is very, very strong. And the reward for the drug, because of this memory, is very powerful. There are no competitions. The other stimuli are not activating the drive. So I say I am an alcoholic. I see the glass of wine. It's a cue, that visual. I start to salivate. My heart rate goes up. My amygdala gets activated. And it's stimulating release of dopamine that drives my motivation. My prefrontal cortex says, wait a minute. You have to give a presentation. You cannot be intoxicated. And I'm in that conflict of my drive, my physiological drive, I'm salivating, sweating, wants to drink it. My prefrontal cortex says, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. This is too powerful. This is too powerful. It overcomes when the amygdala gets hyperexcited. Instead of the prefrontal cortex inhibiting it, the amygdala inhibits the prefrontal cortex. It disconnects it. And that's why when someone is very angry or in a state in which the amygdala gets excited, you cannot think properly because the prefrontal cortex gets disconnected. These are the breaks. Gets removed. And that leads to the taking. So these hyperdrives take it, whether the drug is very attenuated or not, it generates that cue, that expectation that there's a reward. This is not able to stop it. And you get in a positive feedback loop that goes and goes and goes and goes. And in an addicted person, an alcoholic will drink and drink and drink until they throw him out of the bar or they collapse. This is the state of drug addiction. So how do we use this knowledge to address the problem of drug addiction? In my view, you need to address it in a multi-pronged approach. Recognize.
Control those the core runs much more.
So of course, the executive control function that we are talking about here, which exercises the restraint, that in itself is not an independent factor. So
fixed.
It's not fixed. So one could, increase its strength.
Knowledge increase.
Absolutely.
You see that increase. And conviction increase. Then there's an increase.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's what we are trying to do. That's what actually.
So that the control structure the medication the awareness
So now if we take that as one area of intervention, trying to increase that strength, can it be done pharmacologically or
awareness
or bringing greater awareness could make the
both
education?
Both, and that's why I'm so fascinated about the power.
So if it can be done pharmacologically, then it's in some sense it's simpler. So we can all try that approach.
No need education, no need of knowledge.
No.
Just ask doctor.
No, it would be wonderful. I wish.
Yes,
Not so simple. But what we are promoting research to help develop interventions that strengthen that control. And the way we are thinking about medications is not like a magical thing that's going to increase your function, but a medication that you can give a person while they are engaging on an intervention so that they can focus, to help them with the intervention that you are doing, not as the solution, because by itself, we know it's not how the brain works. We do not know of any single one drug that can increase control. It would be fantastic. We would stop a lot of the problems of the world. People would not fall into temptation. They will be able to resist it. But that drug does not exist. There are many extremely exciting interventions, and there's been some studies published with meditation that have actually shown that when they engage individuals that are addicted, this was done in smokers, in a meditation intervention, without telling them what their outcome they were looking for was. They didn't even tell them, we're giving you this intervention so you stop smoking. They didn't say anything. They actually were able to show not only that in the brain images they strengthened the prefrontal areas, but they also showed that smoking behavior went down.
This was a mindfulness intervention that really primarily focused on awareness.
There's also the use of brain imaging to teach you how to actually inhibit, using your frontal cortex, how to inhibit the amygdala. So you use the feedback from the images that you're observing to actually identify what internal processes you may be able to do in order to actually inhibit amygdala. So that's another intervention, using biofeedback from observing your own brain images. Another one that
So is it done by showing just patterns, or
you are looking immediately.
Like a bar.
They are doing an fMRI and they see a bar.
so you have a bar? Yeah, okay.
Whether you can strengthen or low. You can use EEG, electroencephalography. Another approach that is very important is that at the fundamental damage in addiction is the loss of the capacity to experience pleasure and excitement and engagement in activities other than drug taking. So there needs to be intervention to strengthen the power of other experiences, because the human brain is very complex and requires stimuli, whether it's internal, external. So you need to provide them to the person that is addicted to drugs. And I'll put forward, and indeed there are many interventions that are done that are based on spiritual recognition, awareness, knowledge, to help people, provide them with a richness that their life doesn't have, so that there's a competition vis-a-vis the drug. The cue, that memory, are there certain things that we can do to actually decrease the power of the memory, to try to erase it, so that the individual is not automatically driven to these intense cravings produced by that experience? Can we erase it? Can we generate a new memory that's more powerful and can overtake it? And at the end of the day, we don't need to choose one over the other. We can do a holistic intervention that can help put all of these into a better balance to help the person stop taking drugs. My last slide is one I actually cannot resist. I'm not resisting the temptation, but because I think it's a wonderful. I like metaphors, and I like visual displays, and I like the personal experience of someone that has gone through the process of drug addiction. And this is a painting by Gustafsson, a contemporary painter who is an alcoholic, who was an alcoholic. And this is his self-portrayal. And I cannot think of a better image that can capture the poverty and yet the intensity of what it is to be a drug addict, where the world has completely narrow, and is driven by that memory of taking the drug.
Thank you,
Thanks
Nora.
for your attention.
Jim, do we have a tea break?
10 minutes.
Wonderful.
Thanks.
So we will now have a 10-minute tea break. Please come back into the room in 10 minutes to resume.
Less than 10, yeah.
Less than
Ideal.
10. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. And in the next half hour, we have an opportunity to further explore some of the important issues that were raised in Nora's presentation. And Nora and Wendy Hessenkamp and I were talking yesterday and reflecting on the opportunity that we have with Your Holiness. And we thought that the first question that we wanted to begin with is to ask you, Your Holiness, to comment on how, from the Buddhist tradition, can we create an intervention and do it in a way that's secular to help these individuals who are afflicted and who are suffering to overcome the strong urges and desires and craving that are so at the core of the problems that they have.
Didn't you hear
No, da kuntu sebada de shukshum shujor ba.
Right.
Ko ya nyama samam tamani de ka kanga yuni kita engom shonya solo na ju to ne da chik secular level.
That's, I think, difficult. I don't know. It's called devil means simple. Oh.
The problem is, the situation has already reached a point where the person is experiencing the consequences of that behavior.
In that samlun to that jig tane, Kazusne Lubu, the Pungbu, the Kazu to Jasol, the Pungbu, Nalo, Koshujin, Lesaro. That is it. Got a measure on to you, chance and Yamni.
So, because in these kind of situations, extreme cases, the habituation to these, substance abuse has reached a point where it has actually altered the very physiology and the brain of the individual. So, in that case, trying to have a mental kind of intervention may be more problematic. So, in that, at that level, at that stage, initially pharmacology or medication might be actually better. So you are in a better position to suggest.
그러나 이 거리 배질len 쪽이란다. 뭐시도 업무상도 쓴 거지. 레지 넘버 멤버는 맞아서 소소한 심지 배질다. 드부민스비 그도로 되냐더다.
So there is in fact a recognition in the Buddhist context that once the causal processes has reached a point where the fruition of that process has taken place, there is not much one can do. So this is of course in the context of karma. Karma is this kind of action cycle, and when the action cycle has actually led to its own fruition of the consequence, the consequence has already taken place, so it's difficult to revert it.
So what my sort of main interest, and our group, I think our group's main interest is how to prevent these things in order to build strong, healthy mind. Then these certainly can reduce. So they are very possible. My sort of, I always telling the secular ethics. I think it's the. If we really effectively promote awareness of this inner value, then certainly the person become much more happier. As a mental level, always relax. There's no need these drugs or alcohol, these things. Then people, I think, through more awareness, eventually, I think people will develop some kind of the realization or awareness. Ultimate source of happy life is within ourselves, not on these things. So these people, I think usually I blame materialistic society, materialistic culture. So you say, because of those ones.
So yesterday, His Holiness
talk,
I'm referring to my reference to the consumerist culture.
So actually, you see, people, I think, promoting that culture from the childhood. So then, naturally, it's in completely sort of neglect about our inner value. That's the problem. I often insist sort of expressing the very existence of our education system is very much oriented about material value, not talking about inner value, only religious side. Then religion, as yesterday mentioned, the theistic religion, philosophical viewpoint, you see, there are some contradiction, but it doesn't matter. It really helps, gives some kind of
Hope,
purpose
purpose.
or life and hope. So, those people who already sort of troubled, and then I think it gives just a chance.
So the refuge is really people like you. So for the addict who are already at that extreme stage, then the refuge is the medical establishment and medical treatment.
Yeah, I wish we had them.
If I got some problem, that kind of problem, then I have to come to you to seek help.
And I was coming to you to seek help.
So thing is, there's
a Tibetan saying that you need to put the barrier kind of before the water floods come in. The floods come in.
So education is very, very important. Education increase awareness, the value of material things, value of internal thing. Then pay more attention about internal sort of the
Values.
because the values of these sort of the
resources that you have within yourselves.
Yes.
Nora, the institute that you direct, NIDA, funds some research on the application of preventive strategies in children. I wonder if you can share with His Holiness as well as with all of us some of the more successful programs and how they've been implemented and what the outcomes are.
And I agree. The most important intervention we can do is prevention. Unfortunately, that is not necessarily recognized as one of the priorities, and we don't invest in prevention efforts. What the prevention efforts are highlighting is, just like you say, interventions very early on in life, so you can strengthen the position of each individual to maximize their own resources. The prevention efforts that have been shown to be most valuable are the ones that have multi-pronged approaches that involve the family. The family is a key component. And yesterday we were discussing it and the importance of the social structure as one of support and richness for the individual, and one that is extraordinarily reinforcing. And the rejection, the withdrawal from those social systems can be very aversive. So, and that's why an intervention that provides a child and a young adolescent growing up, that social support, or even an adult, is crucial as a prevention effort. If you withdraw them, if you do not give them that sense of belonging, of acceptance, you put them on a path of vulnerability. So it's not just your genes, it's that exposure. We're very social creatures. We need each other. We need to feel part of something.
Absolutely.
If we don't have that, that's aversive. And that is great vulnerability on drug. So when you do a prevention effort, not everybody is born into a family that cares. They are born into situations where they are very isolated. So you need to provide a community that can compensate. So that is why the interventions that appear to be the most effective are the involve the family, the community, and the educational system. Educating kids and about healthy lifestyles as opposed to don't take drugs. The education, drugs are bad. You need to educate them about what is it that they can do with their life, not just the negative.
Yeah, that's right. Oh.
Those are the, prevention strategies that gives them behaviors where they can accomplish. So in that respect, for example, interventions that target kids that are in sports, that targets the sports groups. Interventions that allow them to exert themselves through art, something where they can accomplish, are very, very, very useful. Those are the prevention efforts that have shown significant benefits. And then there are also those that are tailored for those at risk. And you were speaking about the marshmallow experiment yesterday, and you showed the data which indicates that kids that have poor self-control very early on, that are impulsive, are at greater risk of taking drugs. So interventions that can strengthen in the child the mechanism of self-control, resist the marshmallow, have been shown to actually improve outcomes, to decrease drug use, to improve performance at school, to improve ability to sustain effort and not give up. And those also are good outcomes. And finally, there is a population, and I didn't speak about it, that is at greater risk for drugs, and that is individuals that may be suffering from a mental illness, that may have depression, that may have a learning disability, that as children or adolescents, they just want to feel better. They don't know that there's something wrong. And they may take drugs as a means to feel better. So those are interventions that are more tailored for individuals that may be at greater risk. So those are some of the prevention efforts that we are funding.
I'd like to go back to this issue of the...
As you mentioned, the importance of family and society.
Community, no? Community,
Society.
society.
Community. So we have to think, mainly education. The present society come from existing education sort of system and live present sort of because of the environment, more materialistic culture. Difficult. So we have to think, so how to change that? Firstly, individual, then family, then community, then I always say the global level, 7 billion human beings. So here we need strong sense of oneness of humanity. With too much of emphasis, my nation, their nation, my religious people, their religious people. These are hindrances. So we must go to fundamental level. We are same human being. My future depends on rest of the humanity. Thinking that way, then automatically develop sense of concern of the well-being of the humanity, even the planet. And these sort of different species, sometimes I sort of express these species of mammals or birds and these things. Birds, of course, especially, very nice. Or sometimes hawk really disturb these small, peaceful birds. So sometimes my attitude is a little bit negative. In Tibet and early part here also, I use air gun to expel hawk. You see, I'm feeding birds. Very nice, peaceful birds. One hawk used to come. One of them. And my compassion is biased.
My compassion is biased too. I don't like predators eating others.
And then mosquito, sometimes, you see, exception.
They have a right, the mosquito. They have the right to live.
Oh, yes, of course. Right.
They have dopamine, the mosquito.
Oh, very good. Yes.
So I wanted to perhaps go back to the issue that Nora so beautifully raised in the next to last slide, where she presented the model of the urges and craving, which comes from the emotional part of the brain and the strong memories, and then the centers which provide regulation. Now, these are characteristics of everyone's brain. This is the way all individuals work. And as we said, as Nora said in her presentation, as we've said repeatedly throughout the meeting, the issues that we're describing are all on a continuum. The severe addicts that Nora has been studying, that we've talked about, are one end of the continuum, but also, as Nora has said, there are other kinds of addictions. We're addicted to money, to oil, which may be somewhat less severe, but nevertheless along the same continuum. And it may be that the impairments in the brain that we see in the most extreme forms of addiction are less apparent in those lesser forms of addiction, but nevertheless, those forms of addiction have gotten the species and the planet into a lot of difficulty. And clearly, those are very important to address as well. And so I wonder, Your Holiness, if you can just help us to, in thinking about the secular ethics initiative, as well as other related activities, this general issue of the delicate balance between urges and temptations and how we can exercise restraint. There are so many methods in the Buddhist tradition that have been used to address that kind of relationship. And I wonder, particularly in the strategies with children, if there are specific recommendations or ideas that you think scientists might be able to explore that we can usefully incorporate into the curricula that we're focused on.
가서다. 저 조시 과수지.
나를 조시고 나주 나로는 돔섬 때다 조시의 주도를 방고 요자 또 부조 라베 갑이야 데로 시행게 되지 나로는 되네 주 나주는 곰주고 냠내 로장야 레레질렌제 비게라렌 따라야 답시 가르가르 요나스 그다가 고유 견자제야 망부지 되바
그래서 저는 내발 타면 뭐.
그래.
주저 싸움다로.
그래.
그래서 kada deba di realistic deba koya di.
So if we
Ngayon nesul rambachi ki tat deba chune tat gyes ka ayno. Tan deba be tame bigan chin. And ko ni maji so yongdo.
So generally desire in itself is not an issue, and one can have desire that is more in tune with the reality. So if you have a desire that is more in tune with reality, then you don't go into these extremes. But on the other hand, desire also has this quality where if it's left unchecked, it can be limitless. You know, you want everything. And it's that kind of unrestrained desire or want that is often the source of problem.
Of course, it's difficult to say. 가서 다 저절이야. 지금 냠부를 찌 상말이야. 너무 가고 싶어요.
So given the complexity of the problem, it's very difficult to suggest one approach and say this is going to be the effective solution.
Sure. I think, you see, if we really develop some kind of sense of concern of the well-being of humanity, 7 billion humanity, and also, I say, the happy planet, then of course, meantime, you see, all 7 billion human beings same right to achieve certain living standard, but a lot of poor people there. Then think these poor people, then automatically you feel, oh, I have the opportunity to use most of the facility But think those millions of poor people, hungry people, and automatically you feel, oh, chikasota, so exist, survive chak. Those necessities for survival. That, of course, you have right. Then beyond that, must think those people. So I think the awareness, and sense of concern. Then planet itself. This is only home, if you think properly. And this is not only my home, but 7 billion and limitless birds, animals. So, sense of responsibility, take care. So there are a lot of things.
So you need
and here I think
multiple factors.
Realistic the approach. So therefore I think all major religious tradition, you see talking, simplicity, contentment. I think present His Holiness spoke. I think wonderful example. I think a few days ago, you see, he dismissed one German bishop. I think very good. Actually, you see, such people exploiting, use religious faith, and they're exploiting. So these are not practicing this dharma or religion sincerely. So since the Bible is telling us the simplicity, or the Jesus Christ himself is showing us, and many good Christian practitioners show us this simplicity. Many good monks, many Christian good monks, Christian monks, nuns, really, their life, their living lifestyle, very simplicity. So I think actually, if you lead in that way of life, much happier, with more contentment. If you become slave of greed, then these are the
cravings increase.
If you become sort of slave of greedy, you never get satisfaction. Always want more. That's unrealistic, isn't it?
But it's biology. You want more and more and more.
Biology they drive the orders.
I don't think. This physical, you see, actually controlled by mind.
Yeah, you can. Yeah, absolutely, and you are right. But it's. I mean, I wonder, and people that have so much money and they cannot use the money and they just want more money, and it doesn't make any physiologic. There's no sense. It's just more and more and more.
Yeah, this time right?
Does anyone, Matthew, do you want to, in the last few minutes, you had a point you wanted to make earlier?
When His Holiness was asking about the correlation between what scientists can see and the inner states, at least on 2 occasions we did something similar. One was with electroencephalogram, and we were doing different levels of compassion, say neutral state, and then, sort of a little bit, and then medium, and then stronger, and then the best we could do, anyone. And you had a small keyboard, and you would go from 0, 1, 2, 3, 5. And then you would do up and down, so relax it, and then bring it back, come back to rest, do a little bit, and then more. So you would, as you do little bit, you would do 1, and then little stronger 2 of 3, and then the best you can 5, and then like that. And so the measurement was corresponding to your different levels. So if you did half, it will show half, and if you did strongest, it will show the strongest. So there was a correspondence between our feeling and the intensity measured in the brain. So it was followed up, the ups and downs like that. And similarly in the in the fMRI with Tanya Singer. She was also asking to modulate, say, a third of what we can do of compassion. 2/3 means stronger, or more clear, or more intense, and then the full we can do, and alternate like that from 30%, 60, 90, 30. So go up and down, up and down. And then similarly, what they record in the brain was also going, following the same intensity that the subject was actually experiencing. So there was at least a visible correlation between inner quality or intensity or clarity of the meditation of compassion and what was measured. So that means you don't totally predict from looking only at the brain, but you can follow this variation goes together.
And one of the,
나를. So again here the subject is reporting by pressing the numbers.
Yes, but they only can correlate.
the jail that you got
It's not. They can see that the numbers correspond to the levels. I mean, that's whether if they don't correspond, then, and also with the MRI, you don't press anything. Later you report. I mean, what you did, 30%, 60%, 90%, and it does correspond. So then you don't do anything. You notice what you have done, and then the level corresponds to what is measured.
So then the question is that so this is to Matthew. His Holiness was asking Matthew, in that case, the brain expression that you see, is it a
first some sort of movement in brain, then compassion develop, or compassion develop, that change brain.
Same time, same moment.
No. 아랑 아주 뒤셔요. 자셔도 똥자셔요. the same time 셔도
because at the mental level, as we discussed earlier, the speed is very fast.
Well, the speed,
Yes,
but
yes,
as we
yes.
also discussed, the speed of the electrical signals is also very fast, on the order of thousandths of a second, every thousandth of a second.
자상 electric 구조 점리 레벨 구조 좀. 레벨 구조 대학 거라 electric 구조 점리 레벨 구조 좀.
So the changes, the activation in the brain is a consequence of the electrical activity.
So electric sort of movement first, then the particle of the brain change.
Otherwise, who's deciding 30%, 60%, 90%? No, there must be. Anyway, that's a big problem.
Yes, this is quite quite complicated.
Yes.
But at the same time, I think very, very important. I think ultimately, I feel seeking happiness from material,
Outside sources.
Material thing,
Outside sources.
very much connected with the belief. Mind come from brain. Now, if another sort of viewpoint, emotions, mind affect brain. Of course, brain at a grosser level of mind very much related.
It's as a support and a supported.
But mind, there are different level of subtleties. So in any way, once we realize, mind is superior, can control or can affect physical, then more pay attention about training of mind. If mind is the brain sort of
Processes.
and then just deal with the brain. So I think whole sort of
A kind of standpoint, the viewpoint.
Well, one way that neuroscientists can think about it is that the best way to achieve specific changes in the brain may be through transforming the mind.
그래서
그래다 간다 레베 차시 쳐다보질는 요태야 줘야래야 그냥 로장제 뒷돈에 용해 버지 되게 캘린지 쪽으로 가서
제가 걸 브레인 수슈긴 되기도 와.
So this supposes that the mental activity actually impacts the brain.
No sir, no.
In one sense, yes, and in another sense, the conventional view of neuroscientists is that the mental activity arises from the brain and then affects the brain, both. So it's, as we all say, it's very complicated, and there are still many problems. And I think the most important thing is that we as scientists learn to be humble in the face of how much we don't know.
That's right. That's right. I think.
Yeah, I think that's a very good statement.
I think within this century, later part of 21st century, I think more knowledge.
Knowledge.
So scientific-minded people, honest scientists, their mind is open and remain skeptical. That's very good, wonderful. That's the basis of progress. If your mind fixed, I don't know you why did black say that, but the tasha in the
So and also if your mind is fixed, then the kind of modern Western tendency of looking at things in black and white terms will influence.
So I think on this note, Your Holiness, thank you so much. It's lunchtime. We appreciate your time.
Oh, listen.
Listen.
I say, all right.
No.
Thank you, Nora.
No thanks. And that signals reward. And that is what's believed to be why cocaine is so rewarding and so addictive. So if we've used the methylphenidate instead of cocaine, we block that transporter, dopamine accumulates, dopamine binds to these receptors, so that when you give raclopride, these receptors are occupied and it cannot bind, and the binding goes down as a function of how much dopamine has been liberated. The more the dopamine, the more the receptors are occupied, and the less the raclopride can bind. And that's the way that we can actually, in the human being, measure changes in dopamine produced by a drug or by a natural stimuli on the basis of the decreases in raclopride binding. We can quantify these, and this is the quantification for different subjects. So this is an image, this is quantified. And at the same time that we're giving them methylphenidate, we're asking them, please describe how intense is the experience of reward that you're feeling with the drug. And what you find is the more the intense the experience, the greater the increases in dopamine. So in those individuals in whom dopamine is increased very much by the drug, there is a very intense experience of reward. Those that don't feel anything, that have no changes in dopamine, indicating that in the human brain, these drugs, by increasing dopamine, are producing a subjective experience that individuals are describing as rewarding. But I want to note something that has always fascinated me. We're giving the same dose, and look at the variability. So each one of us as humans has a tremendous diversity on the way that we respond. And we know that from the environment, but also to a drug. And that, I think, is one of the starts when people ask me, well, why do some people become addicted and others do not? Not every brain responds to the drugs the same way. That's one of the first factors that's going to determine the differences in the approaches that people and vulnerability that people have to taking drugs and to becoming addicted. Because of this, and
yeah, the and 심주 제어에 그게 drugs Australia 가서 우리 response랑 맨날맨 여기 야 시절 레벨에 기타 야 지금 나다로 제주 참여관에 맨날 여기 진지 한테 제거를 말해.
So since there is this variability among individuals in their response to the dopamine, the kind of increase in their brain, as you pointed out. His Holiness is asking the question. So
But
given this, no,
some person
yeah,
more effective,
Right.
some person less.
effect.
So far the level.
So given this difference among individuals, has there been any research
In order
done?
to find the answer,
Answer,
so basic sort of structure, or the sort of the
chemical
or chemical
compositions.
or the brain, mental.
So has there been any research done on trying to figure out at the brain level, why are these differences among individuals to responding? Is it because of the different chemistry in the brain, or is it different brain structures?
Absolutely, and that's one of the most interesting questions. Why? Why this one has this response here and this one this response
저는
here?
why said the level mental 여기 인주산에 said the new tender mental study
So,
level level
so in principle, one should be able to say that given the differences at the level of brain among individuals, that they will respond differently to the drugs.
One time, one scientist, at that time, at 6 billion human beings. So 6 billion human beings, because of the chromosome or this, some word, you see, very subtle level, you see each one differences. So therefore, to 6 billion human beings, the vision is what
The perception of the
perception of world. Also, you see 6 billion
perceptions.
Yeah.
So that means, of course, roughly speaking, it's the same brain, but very
Yes.
detailed, then differences.
Yeah.
So can you, so far, I mean, you mentioned that
So given that there is this variation, so His Holiness's question is, what, that suggests that there is a difference at the level of
To say drug addiction fits the criteria of what we call a disease because we can identify that there is harm to the tissue. Just like you do with heart disease, there is harm to the muscle, just like we do with drug addiction. There is harm to the area of the brain that allows us to exert judgment, decision, to control our desires. How does it happen? Why, of all of the chemical compounds that are in nature, there are just a very few of them that can produce addiction. And there's been an enormous amount of work done using experiments in animals that have shown that all of the drugs, whether it's cocaine, heroin, alcohol, all of them have a similar pharmacological effect, which is they increase dopamine, the chemical dopamine, in the nucleus accumbens. This nucleus accumbens is a main, what we call hub. In networks, there are centers that are very important on communication. The nucleus accumbens is the most important hub of the reward network. Reward is yesterday we were discussing this, is a complex word that we have simplified as if there were one reward. It's evident that rewards are multiple. All of them require activation of the center. That does not make them the same. It just means that the coloring of a certain positive element to it, a certain positive experience, is associated with activation of the nucleus accumbens. But the activation by dopamine has a purpose. If I feel something positive, my brain automatically learns it and motivates my behavior towards performing that action that will increase the likelihood that I will have that same experience. And that's why nature, in its extraordinary wisdom,
Marel, tana Quran discutante dopamine ya zede lebe tana nucleus accumbens de na levigala ene deje ngobo chilia de tunye cheche de kechin butzin ta lala rewa na chi lala ta rewards lala rewa se ta de chen dugala ane di to ne chawadal jugun dugala di shugutina sing cho yungure samsam chi ane ko rewa chir tangje deje ngobo de 지금 이동과 통해 숙체 쪽에서
And so dopamine has that when there is an experience that increases dopamine in the nucleus accumbens, it generates a memory that is going to drive you to want to repeat the behavior. The more intense that dopamine increase, the stronger the memory. And this has led many to recognize as drug addiction as a disease of memory, of learning. And yesterday, when you were presenting on the experience of how the Buddha philosophy speaks of craving, there requires an experience. That experience requires to have, you spoke of sensual pleasure.
Yeah.
It's an experience that has to activate dopamine, and if it does, it will generate a memory that will elicit craving.
소화된 용부터 tembal이 냐제 아니 뒤 돈은 그런 숙체로지 아니 안겨도 대슈군 주제 아니 공부해야지 이거를 나온다 소외견 그 세바세데 그래서 낭배슈는 시험하는지 다르셔서
Biologically, the function of the system is, among other things, to make us eat. And it's also, its function is when you, for the first time, you are in a place, you have no food, and you try a fruit. The fruit provides sugar, and the reward activates dopamine. You get conditioned. So the next day, when you are in the same environment and you see it, you desire it. And that is the way that biology has ensured that you will do and get that orange and eat it, ensuring your survival, because you need that for survival. That's how these whole systems evolve, and they are described in all of the mammals. They are described also in flies, in fish. It's a very, very primitive physiological system that has served nature.
Your Holiness, we have, over the last 2 days, begun to survey this territory of craving, desire, and addiction. And we have covered both the basic neuroscientific research that gives us some clues about the brain mechanisms that are associated with wanting and liking. We have also considered some of the Buddhist psychology and how that relates to issues of craving and desire. And in the neuroscientific work that Ken presented, it was very basic research in the laboratory, and today we're going to be extending that into the clinic with real people who suffer from addiction. And Your Holiness, today it's a personal thrill for me to introduce you to Nora Volkow. Nora is the first director of a national institute, one of the institutes at the National Institutes of Health that we've ever had here in Dharamsala. Nora is the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and in that role, she is a major scientific leader as well as a leader in the policy and treatment of individuals who suffer in this way. And she's probably the most influential person in the world in research and policy pertaining to addiction. And so, and she is a psychiatrist by training. I've known Nora for many years, and she is an old friend, and it's just a thrill that she accepted our invitation to participate, and I think in part because she has been inspired by some of your writings and teachings, and so with that, it's just a great honor to have Nora present this morning.
Welcome. Thank you.
So it's a privilege for me to be here, and I thank you for giving me this opportunity. one of the things that I was hoping to gain a knowledge and insight is as we address the concept of addiction. To me, it epitomizes that state of the brain where the person has lost the ability to exert control over their desires and emotions. And the Buddhist tradition is basically exactly the opposite. So I think it could be extremely helpful for us to try to understand how can we help an individual that has lost that capacity regain it. I come from the medical tradition.
다는데 맹검쇼 얘기 미기 레벨 체베나 그 얘기 또는 당진 체가 뉴라와 정말 라베서 차르스 단 나오죠 토리아 텔레고도네 네 룽아가 예줄 당진 체가 라와 갖다 고주지다 간배죠 근데 지금 나오죠도네 시버 시라 여러봐서 다티지도 걸고 맹검쇼 얘기 레벨 때네 디 독초도 남배나 시거스 맹검쇼도 걸 라와쇼도 걸봐 그 남주 배주 제제 전시에 대야 돼. 그 남주 나 전시에 된다고 시범 보여줘 가지고 nom소다 던져래 땅. 던져래 땅진 체게. 누가도 데르게 봤어.
And my experience has been as a physician and in dealing with patients, and I'm a psychiatrist, one of the very frustrating experiences was that people that were addicted to drugs were never treated. The addiction was ignored. And in the United States and in many places in Occident, addiction is treated as criminal behavior. And persons that are addicted to drugs are placed in jail. And the outcomes are actually very, very negative. So one of the passions on my life has been to try to understand what happens in the brain of people that are addicted so we can try to figure out ways to help them stop taking drugs. I've also been very committed towards making the healthcare system become responsible for the treatment of people that are addicted to drugs, such that you're very well. Drugs, for what we call randomness of chemistry, activate it. But it activates it in an artificial fashion because it's not the experience of nature and you interacting with it that's activating that nucleus accumbens. It's a chemical substance that directly goes into the brain and by its molecular mechanisms stimulates this center. The chemistry alone, without the whole external experience. And it also, if you look at food, how much it increases dopamine. Drugs, this is amphetamine, are much more potent. That's one. This is very short-lasting. And experiences of that type that increase dopamine from nature, from food, from social interactions, are not so high, not so strong, and they are shorter lasting. This is very strong and very long-lasting. This is not normal physiology, and is going to lead our tissues, our nerve cells, to try to adapt to it. And the brain is very good at adapting. So if in the past, so normally you require this amount of dopamine to stimulate you and to drive your behavior, you take something like cocaine, and it's this gigantic, then the cells, in order to sustain the same level, bring everything down. So you were here and you would require this one. You take a drug, it goes up here. But then the system adapts and everything goes down. So that means that when you are not taking the drug, you do not have the drive. When you take a natural stimuli, you've lost the capacity of excitement by this adaptation. It's being brought down.
라시 렌젤이야 자와군의 론지게 듬바다 저어져 다 텔레노기 중에 가진다 예다 템비기 제디 토자고 잡에 쉬우지 항상 좀 토부연되고 아니 레버코티 애답체제 아니 코마 마통베 랭가 마세베 마냥베 아니 직 남에서 지단에 직 저다 도나다 된데 마용야지.
Now, this is another example of positron emission tomography on how we use it to measure in the human brain how drugs or other experiences increase dopamine in the nucleus accumbens. We use it in the other one. I show you an example of glucose, sugar. Here we use it with a compound. It's called raclopride. It's labeled with an isotope, a radioactive substance, 20 minutes half-life, very short half-life. And it binds to dopamine receptors. So dopamine is increased by drugs. And dopamine is a chemical. And cells in the brain communicate with each other through chemical signals, which we call neurotransmitters. But so these cells wants to communicate to this one, releases dopamine. Dopamine is floating around. And but it wants to specifically activate certain cells or not. And the way that dopamine can do that is the cell that it has to stimulate has a receptor that can recognize it. So it's like a zip code that allows dopamine to go and signal. If you don't have that receptor, dopamine cannot interact. So these are the receptors. And with this substance, raclopride, we can label them. And you see them concentrated in red in the central parts of our brain, which is where the nucleus accumbens is located. We can image them with this radioactive, and you see the concentration. Then you can give a drug, and this is what we give here, a drug that we use in psychiatry to treat children with attention deficit disorder. This drug, methylphenidate, called Ritalin, I've been interested on it because it's very similar to cocaine. People don't like to know this, but it's very similar pharmacologically to cocaine. Psychiatrists don't want to know that. Its mechanism of action, identical to cocaine. Dopamine goes out when it's stimulated, it interacts with the receptors. This is terminated because they have these red proteins here that are transporters. They bring dopamine back into the cell. Dopamine goes up, it goes back in, out, in. Cocaine blocks it. This Ritalin methylphenidate blocks it. Then dopamine accumulates and it binds to the receptors. They don't end up imprisoned as opposed to being treated like we treat other diseases. It has been very difficult because what addiction affects drugs, affects the function of the brain, and the brain expresses itself in behavior. So there is the preconception that you choose your behaviors and that every one of us has the same ability to choose and control. And with imaging, with brain imaging, we now are able to investigate specifically the different areas of the brain and try to determine are there areas that are disrupted in people that are addicted. In my presentation, I'm going to be going over some of the main circuits or networks, as we call them now, that have been impaired by the repeated use of drugs. And that knowledge is valuable because it gives us goals that we can target towards remediating them. And that would be my conclusion at the end of the presentation. There have been several brain imaging technologies that have emerged over the past 20 years that have transformed our understanding of the human brain. You've been exposed extensively to MRI, and today my presentation is going to be about another one called positron emission tomography. Positron emission tomography is an imaging tool that allows us to look at chemistry and function. It's been used, for example, extensively to diagnose cancer, because in cancers, the cells change their biochemistry. And you can use chemical compounds that are labeled with a small concentration of radioactivity to actually locate those chemical changes where the tumor is occurring. It's used extensively to actually investigate how your heart is functioning. These particular images are generated with a radioactive glucose that has a half-life, very short half-life. And the technique is very sensitive, so you need to administer a tiny amount. This
제대 가셨어요.
단들 단들 뒤에서 군대 생야만 보지 숙제 fMRI 또막 녀제도 서시바 그 MRI 디 도교요레스 단나 모랑게 심주셔서 숙제에 P positive emission 가서 topography 시제 PET 세지 level 따지잖아. 카테스 가가요.
Maybe you can say something about how glucose is a main nutrient of the brain and
디제도 지금 벤 캔서 따지제 디돈 다이레스 디 radioactive 제지 메들 제지 또 코디 교육부 되게 말했어. 코데베링가라는 그 남주 레바 나오는
And in this case, the images are with a radioactive glucose, small concentration, the heart. Our organs, our cells need sugar in order to produce the energy to function. The heart, its only function is contraction, contraction, contraction. This is the big muscle consuming a lot of glucose. This is an unfortunate patient that had a myocardial infarct. And you can use this technology to see the area of the muscle that is no longer functioning properly. Because, and you can see that because the cells are no longer taking the glucose because they are not contracting. And the surgeons can take these images and determine where their intervention is going to occur. We can use exactly the same technology, but image the brain, because the cells in the brain also require glucose in order to perform their functions. This is an image of the brain. It's an horizontal plane. It's like you cut it like this. This is anterior, this is posterior. And it is at this level on the top of your eyes. And this part here, the frontal cortex, is crucial for us to make analysis, decision, judgments, to be aware. That area, if you take, this is a normal person, the higher the colors, the higher the consumption of glucose. This is a person that is addicted to cocaine. And you can see that this whole area here, the orbital frontal cortex, has a very significant decrease in consumption of sugar because it's not active. Mm-hmm. And that, in turn, has given us the opportunity, from the perspective of the healthcare system,